Hey everybody, this is chapter 1 of Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class by Tronti. Chapter 1 is titled Hegel and Ricardo. Let's take the chapter from Hegel's phenomenology on the independence and dependency of self-consciousness, on master and slave. Self-consciousness has escaped itself. For this reason, self-consciousness turns into another self-consciousness. But it is not immediately seen as a different essence. In the other, we first of all see ourselves. The duplication of self-consciousness in its unity presents us with the, quote, movement of recognition, end quote, a double movement of both self-consciousnesses, plural, self-consciousnesses. Quote, each sees the other each sees the other do the same as he does. Each himself does what he demands of the other, and for that reason also does what he does only insofar as the other does the same. A one-sided doing, bracket, einseitige tun, end bracket, would be useless because what is supposed to happen can only be brought about through both of them bringing it about, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. So only through the way in which the process of mutual recognition appears to the self-consciousness will the aspect of inequality and thus of opposition present itself. The exhibition of itself as the pure abstraction of self-consciousness consists in showing itself to be the pure negative of its objective mode. Quote, this display is the doubled act, bracket, gedopelta tun, end bracket, namely, both what the other does and what is done through oneself, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. The relationship of both self-consciousnesses is thus constituted in such a way that they offer proof of one another by way of the struggle for life and death, quote, and it is solely by staking one's life that freedom is proven to be the essence, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. But this test, by way of death, risks concluding in a natural negation of consciousness itself, a negation without any independence of that negation's own, quote, negation without self-sufficiency, which thus endures without the significance of the recognition which was demanded, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. The two moments recognize each other anew as essential, precisely because the two moments are unequal and opposed. The two moments are like two opposed figures of consciousness. Quote, one is self-sufficient, for its essence is being for itself. The other is non-self-sufficient, for it, life, or being for an other, is the essence. The former is the master, the latter is the servant, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. Jesus Christ, I keep wanting to say philosophy. Phenomenology of Spirit. The master enters into relation with two moments, to the thing, to the object, to the appetite, and also to consciousness, whose thinghood is essential. But not only that. The master, quote, relates himself to the servant immediately through self-sufficient being, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. This is precisely how he is attached to the servant. Quote, it is his chain, the one he could not ignore in the struggle. For that reason he proved himself to be non-self-sufficient and to have his self-sufficiency in the shape of thinghood, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. End quote. The master likewise relates the master's self to the thing immediately through the servant, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. For the servant to negate the individual thing does not amount to destroying the individual thing. Quote, the servant only processes, bracket, bearbeitet, and bracket it, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. The Lord, conversely, does not go beyond a pure negation. The Lord tends to be satisfied by the Lord's enjoyment of the thing until the Lord has exhausted the thing. For this reason, the master is forced to introduce the servant in between the thing and himself. The master thus obtains the dependency of the thing and pure enjoyment of the thing. But, quote, the master leaves the aspect of its self-sufficiency in the care of the servant, who works, bracket, again, bearbeitet, and bracket, on the thing, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. For the master, quote, it is in these two moments that the master's recognition comes about through another consciousness, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. Conversely, in his own recognition, the master cannot do toward the master's self what the master does toward the other, whereas what the servant does with regard to the servant's self, the servant is supposed to do with regard to the other. Quote, as a result, a form of recognition has arisen that is one-sided and unequal, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. Where the master has found completeness, this has become to him the dependency of his own consciousness. Quote, the truth of the self-sufficient consciousness is thus the servile consciousness, end quote. End quote, in its consummation, end quote, servitude will, quote, become, the opposite of what servitude immediately is. As a consciousness forced back into itself, it will take the inward turn and convert itself into true self-sufficiency, end quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. The conditions are all in place for what the servant does to become, quote, mastery proper. But if servitude is a self-consciousness that arrives at self-sufficiency, it is thus possible and necessary to consider what servitude is in itself and for itself. First of all, for servitude, the essence is the master. For servitude, the truth is the self-sufficient consciousness, which is for itself and thus no longer in servitude. And yet already in this phase, servitude, quote, has this truth of pure negativity and of being for itself, in fact, in servitude in its own self, for servitude has experienced this essence in servitude, end quote. Phenomenology of Spirit. The absolute negativity is not, therefore, only a pure and universal moment in general. In his service, he effectively accomplishes it. Quote, in his service, he sublates all of the singular moments of his attachment to natural existence, and he works off his natural existence. Bracket, und arbeitet dasselbe hinweg, and bracket, end quote. Phenomenology of Spirit. It is thus through labor that the servile consciousness arrives at the servile consciousness's self. In the consciousness of the Lord, the pure negation of the object seemed reserved to the appetite. But this satisfaction merely disguises matters. Both the objective aspect and the essence are missing. Quote, in contrast, work is desire held in check. It is vanishing, staved off, or work cultivated and educates, bracket, bildet, and bracket. The negative relation to the object becomes the form of the object. It becomes something that endures because it is just for the laborer himself, bracket, eben dem arbeitenden, and bracket. That the object has self-sufficiency. The negative mediating middle, this formative doing, is at the same time singularity, or the pure being for itself of consciousness, which in the work external to it now enters into the element of lasting. Thus by those means, the working consciousness, bracket, arbeitende Bewusstsein, and bracket, comes to an intuition of self-sufficient being as its own self, end quote. Nonetheless, the formation of this consciousness is not only this positive meaning, but also a negative meaning faced with its first moment, the fear of the master, which is always, quote, the beginning of knowledge, end quote, for the servant. This objective negative, this alien essence before which the servant's consciousness trembled, is now destroyed. The consciousness of the servant, quote, posits himself as such a negative within the element of continuance. He thereby becomes for himself an existing being for itself, end quote. Phenomenology of spirit. Given the fact that it is externalized, the form does not become another consciousness apart from a servile consciousness. Precisely the form is its pure being for itself, the here becomes truth. Quote, therefore, through this retrieval, he comes to acquire through himself a mind of his own, eigener Sinn, and he does this precisely in the work, in der Arbeit, in which there is seemed to be only some outsider's mind, fremder Sinn, end quote, phenomenology of spirit. And when we are reading this famous text of Hegel's properly, and also keep an eye on the purposes of our research, we must also keep in mind one of Marx's observations, albeit also adapting this observation, when Marx said that, quote, Hegel should not be criticized for describing the essence of the modern state as is, but because he passes off but because Hegel passes off what is as the essence of the state, end quote. Marx. Let's open up Ricardo's Principles of Chapter 20. Let's open up Ricardo's Principles at Chapter 20, which is titled Value and Riches, Their Distinctive Properties. And that's on the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation by Ricardo. Quote, an examination of the difference between use value and exchange value, i.e. a supplement to the first chapter, quote, on value, end quote, as Marx defined it. It begins, quote, a man is rich or poor, end quote, says Adam Smith. Quote, according to the degree to which he can afford to enjoy the necessaries, conveniences, and amusements of human life, end quote. Ricardo comments, quote, value then essentially differs from riches, for value depends not on abundance, but on the difficulty or facility of production. The labor of 1,000,000 men in manufacturing will always produce the same value, but will not always produce the same riches, end quote. Ricardo. The invention of machines, progress in individuals' abilities, the better division of labor, and the discovery of new markets can lead to the doubling or tripling of the existing wealth without thereby increasing its value. The value of each thing, in fact, increases or decreases on the basis of the greater ease or difficulty of production, in other words, on the basis of the quantity of labor employed to produce it. Quote, many of the errors in political economy have arisen from errors on this subject, from considering an increase in riches and an increase in value as meaning the same thing, end quote. A long discussion has developed on what constitutes a typical measure of value, without this discussion ever arriving at sure conclusions. It would be necessary to find some invariable community whose production at any given time requires the provision of the same sacrifice in toil and labor. Quote, of such a commodity we have no knowledge, but we may hypothetically argue and speak about it as if we had, end quote. Ricardo. One thing is for sure, quote, supposing either of these to be correct, a correct standard of value, still it would not be a standard of riches, for riches do not depend on value, end quote. Ricardo. The confusion of the idea of value with the idea of wealth has led to the assertion that wealth can be increased even where the quantity of commodities falls. This would indeed be correct if value were a measure of wealth, given that scarcity increases the value of commodities. But if Adam Smith is right and wealth consists of necessary or pleasurable things, then it cannot increase on account of a fall in quantity. From this, we can conclude that the wealth of a nation can be increased in two ways. Quote, the wealth of a nation may be increased by employing a greater portion of revenue in the maintenance of productive labor, or without employing any additional quantity of labor by making the same quantity more productive, end quote. Ricardo. In the first case, the nation becomes wealthier and at the same time the value of the nation's wealth increases. In the second case, given that more is produced with the same quantity of labor, wealth increases but value does not. Mr. Say, for example, is considered synonymous with not only the terms value and wealth, but also riches and utility. Thus, a quantity of wealth, utility, or use value is easily exchanged for what is, instead a quantity of value. Following this path, he comes to evaluate the value of a commodity on the basis of the quantity of other commodities that can be obtained in exchange for it. Yet before then, a, quote, very distinguished writer, end quote, Mr. Destutt de Tracy, had said, quote, to measure any one thing is to compare that thing with a determinate quantity of the same thing, which we take for a standard of comparison for unity, end quote. The measure of the value of a thing is precisely the thing that needs measuring. They need to be able to be referred to some other measure commensurate with both. Quote, this, I think, can be found, for they are both the result of labor, and therefore labor is a common measure by which their real, as well as their relative value may be estimated. This also, I am happy to say, appears to be M. Destutt de Tracy's opinion, end quote. Ricardo adds, quote, Destutt de Tracy says, quote, as it is certain that our physical and moral faculties are alone our original riches, the employment of those faculties, labor of some kind, is our only original treasure, and that it is always from this employment that all those things are created which we call riches, those which are the most necessary, as well as those which are the most purely agreeable. It is certain, too, that all those things only represent the labor which has created them, and if they have a value, or even two distinct values, they can only derive them from that of the labor from which they emanate, end quote. Destutt de Tracy, end quote, Ricardo. Ricardo did not cite what comes next in Destutt de Tracy's exposition, quote, wealth consists of possessing means for satisfying one's desires, ... We call these means goods because these means do us good. These means are all the product and representation of a certain quantity of labor, end quote. Destutt de Tracy. Say describes, I think it's Jean-Baptiste Say, describes to Smith the error of having attributed the power to produce value to man's labor alone, and of thus forgetting the value attributed to commodities by natural agents, which sometimes substitute for human labor and sometimes combine with it in the production process. In reality, it was Say himself who had forgotten that while these natural agents do increase the use value of a commodity, they do not, of course, increase its exchange value. Quote, M. Say constantly overlooks the essential difference that there is between value in use and value in exchange, end quote. Ricardo. Quote, M. Say accuses Dr. Smith of having overlooked the value which is given to commodities by natural agents and by machinery, because Jean-Baptiste Say considers that the value of all things was... I fucked that up. Quote, M. Say accuses Dr. Smith of having overlooked the value which is given to commodities by natural agents and by machinery, because Say considers... because Smith considered that the value of all things was derived from the labor of man. But it does not appear to me, Ricardo, that this charge is made out, for Adam Smith nowhere undervalues the services which these natural agents and machinery perform for us, but Smith very justly distinguishes the nature of the value which they add to commodities. They are serviceable to us by increasing the abundance of production, by making men richer, by adding to value and use. But as they perform their work gratuitously, as nothing is paid for the use of air, of heat, and of water, the assistance that they afford us adds nothing to value in exchange. End quote. Ricardo, Value, Riches, and Their Distinctive Properties. It's a chapter from Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. Ricardo, Marx tells us, quote, unlike Adam Smith, neatly sets forth the determination of the values of commodities by labor time and demonstrates that this law governs even those bourgeois relations of production which apparently contradict it most decisively. End quote. Marx. So value and wealth are not the same thing, but are the two things opposed. If wealth can be reduced to use value, and value to exchange value, between value and wealth there is the same opposition with constant co-presence that exists between exchange value and use values. It is true, Marx observed in one of his interpretations of this chapter of the Principles, that, quote, with the pure and simple conceptual distinction between value and wealth, Ricardo does not remove the difficulty. Bourgeois wealth and the scope of all bourgeois production is not enjoyment but exchange. To increase this exchange value, there is no means other than to multiply the products, to produce more. To achieve this greater production, it is necessary to multiply the productive forces. But in the same proportion as the productive force is increased by a given quantity of labor, a given sum of capital and labor, the exchange value of products reduces, and the doubled production has the same value as half did before. The scope of bourgeois production is not to produce more commodities, but more value. End quote. End quote. Marx. Notizen und Auszüge über Ricardo's System. March to April 1851, appendix to the Grundrisse of Berlin 1953. End footnote. And thus the aim of bourgeois production is not wealth but value. But Marx adds, without wealth there is no value, without use value no exchange value arises. The aim of bourgeois production is not the mass of necessary object commodities that are useful and pleasurable in life, but the mass of values that are realized within them. It is not the quality of products, but the quantity of their qualitative content. And yet, without the mass of commodities, there is no mass of values. Without the quantitative vest, the product, the quality that it contains would have no form. Capitalist production does not eliminate wealth, but makes wealth serve value. Capitalist production casts it aside as an end while maintaining it as a means. Wealth as use value becomes the phenomenal form of what is opposed to wealth, that is, value. The reduction of wealth to a crude instrument of value production is indeed the condition of capital. When in the same section cited above, Ricardo said that, quote, capital is the part of the nation's wealth employed in view of future production, end quote. Marx rightly continued, quote, here Ricardo confuses capital with the material of capital. Wealth is only the material of capital. Capital is always a sum of values, end quote. Marx. From the same notes on Ricardo from 1851. The equation, therefore, is not between wealth and capital, but between capital and value. The distinction between value and wealth is the distinction between capital and wealth. When wealth, which is to say everything necessary, useful, or pleasurable to human life, becomes the matter of a social production relation, there then springs into action the mechanism of capitalist production proper, and from here stems the construction process of a society of capital. Can we say that at this point all the other fundamental conditions have been realized? If capital is a sum of values, is it not also a sum of labor? From labor to value and from value to capital, we pass by way of the use of wealth as the material of production. On the other hand, wealth is already in this phase of freeing up labor, the creation of a disposable reserve of labor. And here, naturally, we are always speaking of labor power, like more or less everyone else speaks about it. We have not even seen Destutt de Tracy speak of, quote, bracket, the employment of, and bracket, our physical and moral faculties, labor of some kind, end quote. And what is travail quelconque, if not Arbeit überhaupt? Fuck if I know. Too often, quote, so-called primary accumulation, end quote, is confused with the general process of capitalist accumulation as if they were one and the same. But the process through which value is separated from wealth is no different from the process by which the worker is separated from property over the conditions of labor, the producer from the means of production in labor, as labor power and thus as the worker, from capital, except that these latter separation processes do not have to be taken as, quote, processes of capital, end quote. Marx himself called them the, quote, prehistory of capital, end quote. But even this definition is a perilous one. In Marx's work, and beyond, too many prehistorical characters remain attached to the true and proper history of capital. It is necessary to free it of them with the coolest critical courage, by combining a historical labor that reconstructs the processes and a theoretical labor that systematizes the concepts anew. Quote, in themselves, money and commodities are no more capital than the means of production and of subsistence are. Money and commodities need to be transformed into capital, end quote. Marx. For this Capital Volume 1. For this transformation into capital to be possible, it is necessary, 1, the laborer has already emancipated itself from servitude. 2, that value has already subjected wealth to value's self. Necessary, then, is the free worker and also wealth, which, through accumulation, becomes money, means of production, and means of subsistence, subjected to the valorization process, which is to say, compelled to purchase labor power, or better, compelled to pay for labor power. The whole movement thus returns to the side of labor, or rather, to the moment that labor achieves freedom, emancipation, and independence, as labor power and thus as the worker, a moment which can be isolated in the true and proper historical passage from labor to labor power, from labor as servitude and service to labor power, as the only commodity able to subject wealth to value, able to valorize wealth and thus to produce capital. Here is the key that opens up the mechanism of capitalist production. Had Hegel said anything differently in his own language, when Hegel said that, quote, the master is forced to introduce the servant in between the thing and himself, end quote. Oh shit, that's not the end of the quote. Let me repeat that. Had Hegel said anything differently in his own language, when Hegel said that, quote, the master is forced to introduce the servant in between the thing and the master's self. The master thus leaves the whole question of the thing's independence up to the slave who expresses it. Okay, so that's actually not my fault. There's a missing quotation mark here. It's at some point. Anyway, one more time, I'm going to take a guess at where the quote ends. Had Hegel said anything differently in Hegel's own language when Hegel said that, quote, the master is forced to introduce the servant in between the thing and himself? End quote. He thus leaves the whole question of the thing's independence up to the slave who expresses it. It was Marx who said that, quote, Hegel's standpoint is that of modern political economy, end quote. Marx. Marx grasped, I don't know who this he is referring to. He grasped the essence of labor and conceived of labor as the essence of man. He thus only saw the positive side of labor and not the negative side. Quote, the only labor which Hegel knows and recognizes is abstractly mental labor, end quote. Marx. Löwit is wrong. I think he's referring to Karl Löwit. I think that's his first name. Löwit is wrong when Löwit says in this regard, quote, for Marx, labor is, quote, abstract, no longer in the Hegelian sense of a positive universality of the spirit, but in the negative sense of an abstraction from the totality of concrete man, which he wishes to actuate with labor in its integrity, end quote. Löwit. This is not right. If Löwit himself says lower down in a note, quote, this unilateral transformation of the dialectical negation into a simple annihilation characterized the radical attitude of all left Hegelians, end quote. Löwit. What Marx criticizes in Hegel is not abstract labor, but the spiritual, logical, speculative character of this abstraction of labor. Here, too, the movement of history describes humanity's real history, but in the form of a dialectic of abstract thought. At no point in Hegel does the concept of abstract labor go beyond this empirical abstractness. From the Jena real philosophy to the phenomenology and the philosophy of right, we are always and only dealing with the real development of the abstract form. Quote, the I's being for the I's self is something abstract. Rather, the I labors, but the I's labor is something likewise abstract. Bracket, ein ebenso, or bracket, ein ebenso abstractus, end bracket, end quote. Hegel. Universal labor and the division of labor are the same thing. Our working activity becomes ever more mechanical and tends to belong to a single determination. But, quote, the more, bracket, labor, end bracket, becomes abstract, the more, bracket, man, end bracket, becomes pure abstract activity, end quote. Quote, since this labor is this abstract labor, he thus behaves abstractly, according to the mode of thinghood, not as the comprehensive, perspicuous spirit rich in content that dominates a large domain and is master of it. Here there is not concrete labor, but rather his force, bracket, Kraft, end bracket, consists of analyzing, abstracting, breaking down, bracket, Zerlegung, end bracket, the concrete into many abstract parts, end quote. Hegel. In the preface to the Phenomenology, Hegel would say that, quote, in modern times, the individual finds the abstract form ready-made, end quote. Hegel. But already earlier Hegel had spoken of the multiple works of needs, and of things that must themselves, too, realize those things concept, those things abstraction. Quote, need and labor are thus elevated into universality and construct themselves an immense system of commonality and mutual dependence, a life of the dead that moves itself within itself, bracket, ein sich in sich bewegendes Leben des Toten, end bracket, end quote. Hegel, which in its motion blindly ebbs and flows like the elements, bracket, blind und elementarisch, end bracket, and like a fierce beast needs to be constantly harnessed and tamed. This need, which is found in the universal interpretation of the dependence of all, is now for each person the general and permanent wealth. Quote, the possibility of sharing in the general wealth, bracket, Vermögen, and bracket, presupposes skill, health, capital, and so forth as its conditions, end quote. Hegel, Outlines of the Philosophy of Right. Elsewhere, Hegel has said, the first essence is the power of the state, the other is wealth. Quote, whether wealth is the passive or the null, it is in any case a universal spiritual essence. Wealth is the result which is continuously coming to be, just as is the work and the doings of all, as it again dissolves within everyone's consumption of it. End quote. Hegel, Phenomenology of Spirit. Again, labor and wealth, positive and negative, appear in the mechanism of commonality and reciprocal dependence, that is the, quote, system of needs, end quote. What is missing is value, the mediation of value, and values linked with labor emancipated from wealth. In Hegel, the passage from labor to value to capital stops at a correct concept of labor. Hegel aptly starts out from labor as labor power but does not arrive at value. If abstract labor does not meet concretely with the worker, nor does abstract labor meet with the relative abstraction of value, capital is thus reduced, in banal fashion, to a particular wealth, and labor itself as to the mechanical ability of those who work. Indeed, the subject of the first chapter of the Principles is precisely, quote, on value. I think Principles is referring to Ricardo's Principles. Hegel, without Ricardo, would not have allowed Marx to pass from labor to capital by way of the valorization of value. Quote, but at last Ricardo steps in and calls to science, but at last Ricardo steps in and calls to science, halt, the basis, the starting point for the physiology of the bourgeois system, for the understanding of the bourgeois system's internal organic coherence and life process, is the determination of value by labor time. End quote. Marx. Quote, if men employed no machinery in production but labor only, and were all the same length of time before they brought their commodities to market, the exchangeable value of their goods would be precisely in proportion to the quantity of labor employed, end quote. Ricardo. Again, given fixed capitals of the same value and duration, the value of the commodities produced would vary only with the variation of the quantity of labor employed to produce them. Any progress in machinery, tools, manufactured goods, and the extraction of raw materials allows for labor saving. It allows for the easier production of the commodity to which the improvement is applied. Quote, in estimating, then, the causes of the variations in the value of commodities, although it would be wrong wholly to omit the consideration of the effect produced by a rise or fall of labor, it would be equally incorrect to attach much importance to it, and consequently, in the subsequent part of this work, though I shall occasionally refer to this cause of variation, I shall consider all the great variations which take place in the relative value of commodities to be produced by the greater or lesser quantity of labor which may be required from time to time to produce them. End quote. Ricardo, Principles. On this point, we have taken the most cautious of Ricardo's definitions in this regard, namely the one from the third edition of the Principles and not from the first, in the context of the fourth section of the first chapter, which sees the employment of fixed capital intervene to modify the labor principle of value, quote, considerably, end quote. Marx got to the bottom of this discussion in Volume 2 of Capital. Quote, Ricardo, Marx tells us, quote, constantly confuses the ratio between variable and constant capital with the ratio between circulating and fixed capital. We shall see later on how this vitiates his investigation of the rate of profit, end quote. And again, at least to my understanding, and take what I say with a grain of salt, variable capital refers to the portion of capital spent on purchasing labor power, and constant capital refers to the money spent to purchase means of production broadly conceived. Circulating and fixed capital. Circulating capital refers to capital whose consumption is whose total consumption is simultaneous with the production process, right? So Variable cap, you consume the labor power that you purchased immediately in production, right? It's gone. The same thing opposed to, say, to like raw materials or ancillary materials, say like gasoline, right? Its consumption in the production process is immediate and total. Fixed capital, on the other hand, refers to constant capital that was purchased, which is used all over multiple production cycles. So fixed capital generally refers to things such as machines, right, whose value is that are used over multiple capital circuits. Multiple circuits of capital whose value kind of leaks into several batches of commodities produced, right? So if you buy, like, I don't know, a smelting machine, I don't know anything about production actually, so don't listen to me, but you would not just its consumption would not end upon its immediate use in production. Maybe someone else has a different conception of what fixed and circulating capital and what variable and constant capital refer to, but that's how I understand it. Anyway, moving on. The real material of the capital paid out in wages is labor itself, the labor power entering into action that creates values, and the living labor that the capitalist has exchanged against objectified dead labor and which he has incorporated in his capital. For this reason, only the value found in his hands is transformed into self-valorizing value. But, quote, the capitalist does not sell his power of self-valorization. It forms throughout simply a component of the capitalist's productive capital, just like the capitalist's means of labor, and is never a component of the capitalist's commodity capital, like the finished product that he sells, for instance, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Within the production process, the means of labor, qua constitutive parts of productive capital, do not stand in relation to labor power as does fixed capital, just as the material of labor, qua circulating capital, does not coincide with labor power. From the viewpoint of the laboring process, labor power stands counterposed to the means of labor and the material of labor as a personal factor, bracket, persönlicher factor, in bracket, to objective factors, bracket, sachlichen Faktoren, in bracket. From the viewpoint of the valorization process, these same objective factors stand counterposed as constant capital to the subject labor power, as does variable capital. Quote, alternatively, if we are to speak of a material difference that affects the circulation process, this is simply that it follows from the nature of value, which is nothing other than objectified labor, and from the nature of self-acting labor power, which is nothing other than self-objectifying labor, that labor power continually creates value and surplus value so long as labor power continues to function. That what presents itself on this side as movement, as the creation of value, presents itself on the other side of its product in a motionless form, as created value, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. Myrdal, I think it's Gunnar Myrdal, asked himself why Ricardo and other classics after him decided to see the real value of a commodity and the later labor embodied in the commodity. The meter of value thus being a commodity that always contains the same quantity of labor. For Myrdal, Ricardo gave no satisfactory response to this question. He ought to have looked in Marx for the answer he did not find in Ricardo. The response to this question, why labor, would have resolved in the simplest of ways a curious problem of his, namely, quote, for the historian of thought, the real puzzle is why the classics did not draw, end quote, the same, quote, radical conclusions, end quote, that the socialists did, end quote. Gunnar Myrdal, The Political Element of the Development of Economic Theory, end footnote. These were not the last of Ricardo's uncertainties on this problem. On the 13th of June, 1820, Ricardo wrote to McCulloch, quote, I sometimes think that if I were to write the chapter on value again, which is in my book, I should acknowledge that the relative value of commodities was regulated by two causes instead of by one, namely by the relative quantity of labor necessary to produce the commodities in question, and by the rate of profit for the time that the capital remained dormant, and until the commodities were brought to market. End quote. Ricardo. But Ricardo, Marx tells us, never distinguished between surplus value and profit, just as he never distinguished between variable and constant capital. Thus he did not arrive at a correct conception of capital. Instead, Ricardo reduced capital to accumulated labor, to something simply objective, to a simple element of the laboring process, and from which the relationship between labor and capital, between wages and profit, could not be further developed. The same letter continued, quote, "Perhaps I should find the difficulties nearly as great in this view of the subject as in that which I have adopted. After all, the greater questions of rent, wages, and profits must be explained by the proportions in which the whole produce is divided between landlords, capitalists, and laborers, and which are not essentially connected with the doctrine of value." End quote. Ricardo. Works and Correspondences, Volume 8. Ricardo makes a bold attempt to try to separate the theory of value from the theory of distribution, which makes Ricardo move decisively toward conceptualizing value as a cost of production. Ricardo's starting point, value, was right. In the passage from labor to value to capital, though, Ricardo starts out from value but does not arrive at either labor or capital. For Marx, quote, "Instead of labor, Ricardo should have discussed labor capacity, but had Ricardo done so, capital would also have been revealed as the material conditions of labor, confronting the laborer as power that had acquired an independent existence, and capital would at once have been revealed as a definite social relationship." End quote. Marx. So, he lacks a correct conception of labor as labor power as abstract labor, or Ricardo lacks a correct conception of labor as labor power as abstract labor. Ricardo, without Hegel, would not have allowed Marx himself to pass from value to capital by way of production and the reproduction of labor power. And that's the end of chapter 1 of Marx, Labor, Power, Working Class by Mario Tronti. And chapter 1, again, was titled Hegel and Ricardo. Thank you so much for listening. Chapter 2 is titled Exchange of Money for Labor.